Thank you. I'm here to speak to you about a global phenomenon. This phenomenon has affected almost every major capital city in the West. It's certainly affected every Muslim majority country in the world. It affects every one of you, and it definitely has affected Muslims, my own community, because more Muslims have been killed and victimized, murdered, tortured, and persecuted by this phenomenon than any other community or population in the world. I'm here to speak to you about something that we must feel that we have permission to speak openly and freely about. My name is Maajid Nawaz. For 13 years, I was on the leadership of a radical Islamist organization seeking to resurrect the caliphate. I spent 5 of those years in prison in Egypt witnessing torture, and was then released 10 years ago this year. I'm here to speak to you about the global jihadist insurgency. 8 years ago, I founded Quilliam, an organization that is led by Muslims, founded by former Islamists, to push back against the ideological propaganda of Islamist extremists. Now let's pause for a moment, just to define exactly what I'm talking about. When I say Islamism, I'm speaking of the desire to impose any version of Islam, my own religion, over society. I am not speaking about Islam, the faith, which has its own challenges, which religion doesn't. Has its own problems, every religion does. Has its own sects and denominations, just watch Life of Brian and imagine a Muslim version. But I'm not here today to speak about that. I'm here to speak about the desire to impose any version of that religion over society, and that's what I call Islamism. The use of force to spread Islamism, I call jihadism. That's what I'm here to speak to you about today, because lots of things have been done wrong in an attempt to tackle this problem. The first is an inability to even recognize what we're dealing with. I call this a global jihadist insurgency for a reason, because both under the era of President Bush and the so-called war on terror, and currently under President Obama, there has been a fundamental misdiagnosis as to exactly what we're dealing with and how to treat it. So let's go way back. Many of you will remember Bush. Let's go back to President Bush, and to caricature his approach, forgive me for the caricature, but it will demonstrate the point I'm seeking to make. George Bush believed in entering this war on terror that democracy could be imposed at the barrel of a gun, hence the invasion of Iraq, and hence an attempt to democratize an entire nation from top down. We all know how that went. Moving on from Bush, Obama realized those mistakes, recognized the error in an attempt to impose democracy from the top down, recognized that actually, if democracy is a culture, if it is a set of values, it cannot be enforced at the barrel of a gun. So President Obama came along, what did he do? He ditched the democracy piece and turned that gun into a drone and a tank and targeted assassinations and kill lists. In fact, President Obama launched more drone strikes against terrorists that he arbitrarily designated than President Bush ever did. Many of us don't know that. The view was that what we're dealing with is an organized crime gang, and the way to deal with it is the way we dealt with Al Capone. Take out the leader and you deal with the gang. That's the misdiagnosis I'm speaking about. As harmful as what Bush did. We cannot kill our way out of this problem. We cannot shoot our way out of this problem, and we certainly cannot legislate our way out of this problem, as demonstrated by the fact that the same year Obama killed bin Laden by shooting him in the head at point-blank range. Our cognitive dissonance led us to say, when Malala was shot in the head, you cannot kill an idea, long live democracy, yet when bin Laden was shot in the head, somehow we've killed jihadism. The truth is that shooting neither in the head was going to destroy the ideas that they stood for. Of course, I'm on the side of Malala now. Thank God. The point here is that you cannot kill an idea. And yes, there is a place for law. Of course there is. Yes, there is a place for war. I'm not a pacifist. But ultimately, in the long term, to help us get through this, we need to recognize something else. And that is that if this is true, that this is a jihadist insurgency, as what happened after the death of bin Laden proved, that the more you kill insurgent leaders, the more they are able to replace themselves, because no insurgency is able to survive without a residual level of support within the communities it seeks to recruit from. So no surprise that when we killed bin Laden, something even worse of a Hydra's head, the Medusa multi-headed beast emerged, known as ISIS or Daesh. Something that we could never have imagined being worse than Al-Qaeda emerged, because we cannot kill our way out of this problem. And that's what happens when there's a level of support within the communities, because it's the definition of an insurgency, something we should have learned from Vietnam. So what we really need is to diagnose the problem correctly. There is an ideology at play that seeks to recruit people on the grassroots, to radicalize them, and to make them join these organizations. How on earth is it possible, if not for this case, for this to be true, that 6,000 born and raised European citizens go to join the worst terrorist group that history has ever known, if not for the fact that there was a level of support within the communities, because this ideology has been propagated for decades within our own Muslim communities in Europe. I know, because I used to propagate it. 6,000 don't just get up and leave in a vacuum to join the worst terrorist group in history. If we recognize that, we recognize that the solution lies not in our bullets, but the solution lies in our ability to galvanize civil society. The solution lies in our ability to give people the permission to have this conversation. The problem with President Obama is that it was anything but wanting to have the conversation. Because of course, and I'm a liberal too, I stood as a liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate, so I say this of my own political tribe. The danger was not wanting to appear as an anti-Muslim bigot or a racist or an Islamophobe, so let's just hush this conversation down. No. If there's one thing we're going to do and leave this hall doing, it is to talk about this. Because the alternative to talking is violence. The alternative to having this debate, even when mistakes are made, is conflict. And that's all we've been seeing through the Bush era and the Obama era. What we haven't been doing enough of is galvanizing the grassroots and working with civil society activists to push back against this poisonous ideology, this theocratic ideology that has permeated within our own communities here in Europe, in my country of origin in Pakistan, and across the world. What we should be doing, and I'll end on this point, is to leave you with a thought experiment. I gave a TED talk a few years ago, and I mentioned 4 things that these civil society movements need to push back against the Islamist social movements that are working on the grassroots. They need ideas, they need narratives, they need leaders, they need symbols, and they need a goal. And the 5th one is the one I'm adding here just for the Oslo Freedom Forum. I left that one out in my TED talk. And let me explain this. If I go through a thought experiment here with you all and say to you, think of the ideas that ISIS represents or Al-Qaeda represents, you can all conjure that up. If I say to you, think of their leaders, you have the image of bin Laden, etched into your memories. I say to you, think of the symbolism, and you think of the black flag, and you think of everything that, the ISIS propaganda. If I say think of the goal, by the way, you'll think of the caliphate. The goal, even their goal, is clear to you. If I say reverse, take these 5 now, and think of their equivalent in Muslim-majority countries for democratic activists. What are the ideas? What are their narratives, their propaganda, their messaging? What are their symbols? What is the iconography for democratic activism in the Middle East today? Who are their leaders? And what is the goal? What is the young Arab Democrat striving to achieve? It cannot be more dictatorships, and it cannot be more theocracy. But the problem here with that thought experiment is that we come up with a blank. And the reason we do is because there simply isn't currently a significant enough social movement in civil society pushing back against those 5, the ideas, the narratives, the leaders, the symbols, and the goal for Islamism, but with secular, liberal, democratic activism instead. Now, those people exist. Some of them you'll hear from on this very stage, excluding myself, of course. Those people exist. But what needs to happen is the organization, the galvanization, and the permission to have this conversation, because it concerns all of us. You don't have to be black to challenge racism. You don't have to be gay to challenge homophobia. You don't have to be Jewish to challenge anti-Semitism. So none of you should be told that because you're not Muslim, you cannot condemn stoning a woman to death, or throwing gays off tall buildings, or chopping off limbs from body parts. You don't need to know anything about the Quran, my own holy book, nor the hadith, the sayings of my prophet, to be able to condemn stoning a woman to death. All of you have permission to have this conversation. Let's all work together to build those 5 for civil activism, for secular, liberal, democratic activists working within and among Muslim communities to build a better future. Thank you very much.